map maker here in terms of the places where we see Paul stopping. Tarsus. He was from Tarsus. Maybe he made a stop at home. But he worked through this area and through the inland country, as Luke describes it, and comes to Ephesus, which is way over here. And we find that in Acts chapter 19 and the first verse. In Ephesus, he stayed for a while. 3 months and then another 2 years. He was there well over 2 years. And while he was in Ephesus, Acts 19 and verse 21 tells us, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must see Rome. Paul's envisioning where he's going from Ephesus, but he doesn't leave Ephesus right away. From Ephesus, he actually wrote to the Christians in Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 7 through 9 tell us, or he's telling the Corinthians, I hope to spend time with you if the Lord permits, but I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door for effective work is open to me, and there are many adversaries. Well, indeed there were adversaries that emerged in Ephesus. In this same letter to the Corinthians, in fact, in the same chapter that I just read from, chapter 16, he also says this a little earlier in the chapter, 1 Corinthians 16, and starting in verse 1, he says something that I think is kind of important maybe for us understanding what's happening with the people who we're going to be looking at this evening. Concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. He's already told the people in Galatia something about this, and now he's telling the Corinthians. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. What's he talking about here? Taking up a collection. Start now, while I'm still in Ephesus for a while. That way you don't have to try to do it all at once after I get there. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. Money's being collected among churches where Paul is traveling, and he's envisioning that this money is going to be carried to Jerusalem. As Acts goes on to record this trip after these 2 years have passed, he travels from Ephesus, next goes through Macedonia to Greece, which here on this map is labeled Achaia. So from Ephesus to Macedonia, which is this area in the northern part of the Greek peninsula. And then he's also going to end up down here in the southern part. It's generally thought that while he was in Achaia, or Greece, that he spent a lot of his time there probably at Corinth. From there is where he most likely wrote his letter to the Romans. And I want to read from Romans 15 and verse 25. At present, however, well, let me back up one verse. He writes to the Romans, probably writing from Corinth now, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you once I've enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. Well, he wasn't literally going to Jerusalem right then. He was sitting there in Corinth having this letter written. But this is his aim, to go to Jerusalem, to bring aid to the saints. So this is very much in Paul's mind. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. For they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. So from Rome, he's writing to the Corinthians about the collecting of aid for Jerusalem that's been accomplished here in Macedonia and Achaia. Are you with me so far? He stayed about 3 months in Greece. Maybe not all of that in Corinth, but probably a good bit of that time. Acts 20 and verse 3 mentions that he was there actually for about 3 months, and that he had first thought that he would sail from there to Syria, which would have taken him almost all the way back home, but he decided to go back through Macedonia instead. He'd just been through Macedonia, now he's on the roundabout, and he somehow ends up heading back to the direction he came from. Did that ever happen? This is what Paul decides to do. He decided to go back through Macedonia instead, sailed from Philippi, which is right up here on the coast. I'll find it in a second. It's right up in this area somewhere. Here. Philippi, a little bit inland, Neapolis, probably the actual port. From there to Troas, down to here, and then stop along the way. Eventually gets back home. Caesarea, and on to Jerusalem. I want to jump ahead just a little bit. Right, I'm skipping over a verse that's key that we're going to come back to. In Jerusalem, he was arrested. He'd been warned that he would be, and he was. He was taken to Caesarea for his own safety, in essence, but he's still under arrest. And during his defense before Felix, he tells Felix why he was in Jerusalem. He wasn't the rabble-rouser that he was being accused of being. Acts 24 and verse 17, Paul's telling Felix after this trip has essentially ended, he's now back up at Caesarea in chains, and he tells Felix, now after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. The point that I'm just trying to make here is that Paul was on this effort to teach, to preach, to encourage Christians in places where he had been before, but also along with that was this apparently very important to him mission of collecting funds that could be taken back to the needy Christians in Jerusalem, okay, and in that area. So the verse that I skipped over was Acts 20 and verse 4. Paul was not by himself. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. Now, I've highlighted in yellow the first 4 because we've already talked about these others. Seth talked about Tychicus and Trophimus, in fact, on Sunday when he had a group of 4 that he helped us explore a little bit to try to learn a little bit more about these people. My job was to try to do the same thing with the 4 that I've highlighted here. One of the things that we would like to try to impress upon ourselves is just an awareness of the interconnectedness of these Christians all over that whole map. Darrell and Seth and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and the kind of image that I saw in my head based on what I do was one that looks like this. One of the things that I teach about a little bit in my communication course at WKU is organizational communication. And most of you have seen an organizational map. And this is really a map that's designed to reflect the intended communication connections among the people. In this case, I got this off the internet a couple of years ago. I thought it was cute. The physical plant department at Dickinson College. It's somewhere in Pennsylvania. And one of the points that I make in class when I'm talking about organizational communication is this is the planned communication. But then there's also the reality of all the rest of the communication that takes place. And this is the kind of picture I was seeing in my head when we were talking about the interconnectedness of all of these people. We're going to see some of that here again this evening. Now Seth, when he was talking about this, I don't think Seth is here.
No, he's helping with the
I was hoping he would be here to see this.
Go ahead and talk about it.
Okay, I will. Thank you for permission. When Seth explained and gave us a good analogy to kind of help us to see some of this, I don't know where this came from necessarily, but he said it reminded him of a crime board. You can ask him why that's the first thing that came to his mind. But hopefully you kind of get the idea here. I'll be very surprised if several of you have not had this kind of experience. I've thought of 2 or 3 instances that have been kind of notable in my memory. On our wedding night, my wife and I drove from Lexington, where we got married, to Asheville, North Carolina, with the plan to go on to the South Carolina coast the next day. We got married on a Saturday, the next day was a Sunday. In Asheville on Sunday morning, we went to church. And there, at that worship service, was Lowell Alexander. I had known Lowell for years back in Lexington. A few years prior, he had gotten married, and I knew he'd moved away to North Carolina somewhere. I ran into Lowell Alexander in North Carolina. Wow, he actually seemed a little bit glad to see me. I was glad to see him. The Helsleys came up to me after our worship here a couple of summers ago. They had just gotten back from a vacation trip to Florida, and they said, we ran into somebody who wanted to send their regards. And it was somebody I had known as a high school and college age kid, again, back in Lexington. They're now crossing paths with the Helsleys in Florida and sending regards to me in Bowling Green, Kentucky. How many of you have had experiences like that where your paths crossed with other Christians? That happens, doesn't it? It's happened to me so often that it no longer surprises me, really, when somebody comes up to me and says, "Are you Bob Crawley's son?" Fortunately, usually that's a good thing. In the mind of the person who's asking. My father preached all over the southeastern United States and some other places as well, and it's not unusual for somebody to have heard him preach in a gospel meeting somewhere, and they remember that name and connect it with mine. Isn't that amazing? I think the connectedness that we're able to experience is not totally unique, but it doesn't happen often. And how does that make you feel when you experience that? I'm just curious. You run into somebody who maybe you've never met before, but they know somebody who's really close to you.
It's nice knowing that we have a Christian family all over the world. And we can always have family somewhere.
That's the concept, isn't it? What? Can you verbalize why that's nice?
Humans, were made to have relationships. It wasn't good for Adam to be alone. And even as Lawrence preached a couple of years ago, about the Godhead, the Trinity, that there's a relationship. Before we existed, they loved each other, and that's how we're made.
Okay.
But one thing I wanted to bring out, as I was listening to your travels about home, and I have not pieced all of these together, all of these references, and as you emphasize the importance of getting this gift of aid to these Christians. Often we'll read 1 Corinthians 16:1, and we focus on the process. That we never focus on sending about messengers, and we don't focus on sending it by Paul, and we don't send it to Judea. We get so focused on the process, and yet what you are referring to, I'm not sure that's really the emphasis of 1 Corinthians 16.
Amen.
It's the people who are in need, and they're helping them. Just like Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, and people got upset. Well, if people are in need tomorrow and we need a collection today, would Jesus go, well, he can't do that? No. The emphasis was these people in Judea were in need, and people who didn't know those people, but knew people who knew those people, loved them and helped them. That's the message.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Let's look fairly quickly now at these four individuals. The four assigned to me, the first four who were mentioned all in that one verse there in Acts chapter 20 and verse 4. And you can be asking yourself maybe, what accounts for this particular collection even being together? How did these people even happen to come together? We can go back to the map for a little different kind of reason here. And the first one that I want to talk about for just a minute or two is Sopater. I looked it up, and I think that's the way you two pronounced it. So what do we know about Sopater? Practically nothing. Where's Sopater from? From Berea. Okay, where's Berea? Besides Madison County, Kentucky. Berea is almost off the map, way up here in the northern part of Macedonia, one of those areas that was contributing to this collection. Berea was an old city even in the first century. It had been old by our standards. It had been there since the 400s BC. It was a place where Paul had visited before. This is where the Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica, because they received the word with eagerness. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men, Acts 17 and verse 12. Maybe Sopater was converted during that preaching visit in Berea. We don't know. One other thing we're told is he's the son of Pyrrhus. Now, there had been a king Pyrrhus about 300 years earlier. I don't think that's the direct connection here. I think Pyrrhus came to be a name that was probably kind of popular. Why do they tell us he's the son of Pyrrhus, do you suppose? Maybe there were Christians who were going to be reading this who knew Pyrrhus. Or maybe this is to help distinguish Sopater from Berea from other Sopaters. I don't know why we're doing this. There's a reference back in that 16th chapter of Romans to Sosipater, Romans 16 and verse 21. And there are many who suppose that this is the same individual. It's not something that really could be confirmed, I don't think, one way or the other. Romans 16 and verse 21. Again, remember, Paul is writing from Corinth to the Romans, and he says, Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you, so do Lucius and Jason, and so Sopater. And there he calls these people my kinsmen. My personal opinion is he's talking about the kinship they have in the faith, not a blood relative. This is Sopater from Berea. Let's go on and look at Aristarchus. Where's Aristarchus from? Anybody remember? Acts 20 and verse 4 tells us. I know I'm throwing lots of names and place names, and believe me, without these notes, I would be even more confused than I seem. Aristarchus is from Thessalonica. Where is this? Well, it's about 45 miles from Berea. Again, right up here in this top corner of our map. Again, in Macedonia. Pardon me. Aristarchus is mentioned there in that passage we've already looked at in Acts 20. Back in Acts 19 and verse 29, in Luke's description of one of the things that goes on back in Ephesus, Demetrius the silversmith stirred up the big crowd and the riot ensues. So the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus. Aristarchus was a veteran of some of the ugly stuff that can happen to you because you're a Christian. He was dragged into the Ephesian theater. as we continue reading through Acts on up toward the end of Acts, we have another mention of Aristarchus. After his hearings with Festus and Agrippa, Paul, you may remember, appealed his case to Caesar. And so Paul, he said he wanted to see Rome. Well, he's going to see it as a prisoner. And Acts 27 and verse 2 says, "And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica." So Aristarchus goes through the trial and tribulation in Ephesus. He's with the group that's mentioned in writing from up in this part of the world. He apparently makes the trip all the way back to Jerusalem, and now he's leaving on a ship back toward Rome with Paul. Wow. In Colossians 4 and verse 10, Paul mentions him, refers to him as Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, and Jesus called Justus. He's referred to there in Colossians as a fellow prisoner. Maybe this is why he's on the ship with Paul. Maybe he's also in custody. Or maybe he just went with Paul to support it. We're not really sure. In Philemon, Paul writes, "Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you." This is greetings to Philemon now, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. Now, he's not a fellow prisoner, he's a fellow worker. Colossians and Philemon are thought to have both been written about the same time during Paul's 2-year imprisonment in Rome. Aristarchus seems to have been identified as a Jew. In Colossians 4 and verse 11, the other part of the passage I mentioned just a minute ago, again, he's named among these other men, Aristarchus, Mark, cousin of Barnabas, Jesus called Justus, the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. So, Aristarchus, we had a little bit of conversation on Sunday about all these people traveling with Paul. Were they all Gentiles? Aristarchus may have been the one who was Jewish, regardless of what his name might be. One of the things that I've picked up on from our study this summer is you can't always tell just by someone's name what their heritage was. This culture's too mixed up. This is a very diversified culture. And so Aristarchus, in spite of his name, may have been Jewish, probably was. Was he a Politarch? Anybody know what a Politarch was? Yeah, I didn't know about these people either. They're a kind of sort of a city level ruler that was somewhat unusual, but they had Politarchs in Thessalonica. And an ancient slab of stone that supposedly was part of a stone archway from Thessalonica from a period around the 1st century lists names of Politarchs. Some people didn't even think there really was such a thing, but there it is, literally etched in stone, 2,000 years old. It mentions Politarchs, and one of the Politarchs' names happens to have the name Aristarchus. Is it our Aristarchus? Well, we don't know, really. But there's what I hope might be some interesting information about Aristarchus. Next in our group, we have Secundus. We know about as much about Secundus as we do about Sopater. Maybe even less. He apparently was also from Thessalonica. He's paired with Aristarchus in the list in Acts 20 and verse 4. So I'm going to tell you he's a Thessalonian. A lot's been made in things that I've read of Secundus's name. Can you imagine what that? Some of you word lovers, what do you think Secundus might mean? Second. That's what it means, literally. My first thought when I saw that was, well, maybe this is like junior. But that's not quite the way this was apparently typically used. There is a significance of this word just in their descriptive language that really had nothing to do with naming someone. It meant favorable in certain kinds of uses, but sometimes this might be the name that was given to someone who was the second-born son in a family. And just to kind of continue this while I'm thinking about it, back in, this is getting to be our favorite chapter tonight, kind of, Romans 16 again, we have references to a Tertius and a Quartus. Second-born, I guess names for people who didn't have creative parents, I'm not sure. But another apparently somewhat common usage of this name had to do with designating slaves. We're going to actually talk a little bit on Sunday about slavery in the Roman Empire. A slave named Secundus, or called Secundus, presumably was the second most important in the household. So, this has given rise to a lot of speculation. Some interesting object lessons have been kind of created around this pair from Thessalonica, Aristarchus, and his slave. We don't know, but that makes an interesting thing to think about. Now, there's also a Secundus listed on the slab of stone naming Politarchs. So there's almost more that we don't know that we'd like to know than what we do know about Secundus, at least as far as what I've been able to discover. Well, let's go on to Gaius. Where's Gaius from? Are you looking up here on this part of the map? Here's a curveball. Gaius is from Derby. Where's Derby? Not just Louisville. Derby's over here. Back in the area of Galatia, Laconia, from what I've read, Derby kind of got handed back and forth among 2 or 3 different provinces in this general region. It was apparently nothing much besides a post where taxes were collected from people who were crossing from one province to another as they traveled. There's been much dispute in more recent years about where exactly was this place really. It wasn't extremely notable, but this is where Gaius was from, at least the Gaius in Acts 20 and verse 4, because it tells us he was from Derbe. Now there are some other mentions of the name Gaius in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 19 and verse 29. So the city was filled with confusion. You may remember I read this verse just a few minutes ago. And they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus. Gaius, someone named Gaius, was in that Ephesian theater. Macedonians, who were Paul's companions in travel. The Gaius mentioned in the tumult in Ephesus was a Macedonian. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, writing to the Corinthians, Paul said, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that none may say you were baptized in my name. And then there's also a reference in Romans 16 and verse 23, writing from Corinth to the Romans, Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, probably the church at Corinth, he greets you. Personally, I kind of think that the Gaius mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1 and Romans 16 is probably the same person. But I don't think that's the same Gaius from Derbe, because that one was from Derbe. He could have ended up in Corinth. 3 John, the first verse, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. That's John writing that short letter. We have Gaius 5 times. My personal thinking is that there's probably 4 different people. The one from Derbe would be the one that was in this group. Why was that such a popular name? Well, a few years earlier, Gaius Julius Caesar was the full name of the first Roman emperor. Maybe that made that popular. Think about the connectedness of these people from all of these different places, traveling together, making big circles through this part of the civilized world for the cause of the gospel and to help other people they didn't even know. I'll see you Sunday.
Yeah, back then.